Today we are joined by Bernard Salt. He is the Managing Director of the Demographics Group and a weekly columnist for The Australian, widely regarded as one of Australia's leading social commentators by business, the media, well, the broader community. The Age has described his style as part stand-up comedian, part number-crunching economist. Bernard is responsible for popularising the following phrases which have now well and truly entered into the Australian dialect: smashed avocado, sea change, tree change, among many others. Bernard, thank you. It is our absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Jacob, for the introduction. Always a pleasure to chat.
It is, absolutely. And look, let's dive right in if that's okay. As a futurist, Bernard, you've recently mentioned that I have a fascination with the future of Australia, and you've had that for much of your career. Can you describe for our audience this area of expertise? What is a futurist, and why this fascination with little old Australia?
Well, I have a fascination with little old Australia because I'm a proud and passionate Australian. I suppose my academic background was in history, the evolution of Australia, the evolution of Australian cities, and from a social, cultural, demographic point of view, to the extent that I will try and place events in their historic sequence when I see something on television or whatever. And when you take that long-term perspective of Australia, from European settlement, or of Tasmania or any other state for that matter, then it prompts the question, well, you can see the evolution of Australian society, of Victorian society, or whatever it is. And it prompts the question, well, okay, that's the journey up to 2022. What do the 2020s hold? If you were standing in 2030 and looking back, what would be the perspective? And I find that an endlessly fascinating concept. Imagine, for example, if you could have stood at 2020 and reviewed what the previous decade what was going to happen over that previous decade, and inform people in 2010 that there was going to be a mining boom, there was going to be a collapse, there was going to be an acceleration of overseas students, and around 2020 there's going to be a global pandemic that would shut everything down for 2 years. It's quite an extraordinary 12-year period. So what is it that we are likely to see in the 2020s? And I suppose the reason why people don't do it is because, well, we don't, to some extent we don't know, but I argue that there are pointers, that there are indicators that would suggest that there are a number of factors that we'll see unfold in the 2020s in the post-COVID world. And certainly business and government is very interested in those perspectives, partly because not many other people are putting much that sort of stuff out there.
Yeah, and I feel you've traditionally been right on the money. And I think some of the trends that you've identified as they are happening, it's not in retrospect, as they are happening have been, truly insightful. And I think Australia is a funny country, and it's hard to think of other examples where we are such a melting pot. We don't have this 100 years of culture or thousands of years of culture. We're sort of making it up as we go is the feeling that I get.
Well, that is very much the case. If you look at Australia's demographic mix, around about 30% of the Australian population or resident population was born outside the Australian continent. That proportion for the US, the great melting pot, is barely 15%. For the UK, it is 14%. For Germany, it is 13%. For Japan, it is 2%. And for China, it is 1%. We are literally one of the most, if not the most, multicultural fusion cultures on the planet. We're continually evolving and changing. We are very unpredictable in that regard, and it makes it an ideal petri dish to examine social change in Australia. 25, 26 million people scattered across the Australian continent, continually churning and changing to a degree that no other nation does. If ever there was a role for a professional demographer in the commercial sense, it would be on the Australian continent, because it's such a churning, changing environment, and one that I find endlessly fascinating, I'll say.
That's wonderful. And look, I feel I'm taking a property investment lens. I guess that's the direction that I've come from professionally, and change creates opportunity. It creates upside, it creates downside. So, where there is this change and, larger, volatility or degrees of change, then there is always opportunity. And that's what I'd love to probably unpack with you today, Bernard, in terms of where that opportunity might lie, with a particular lens for property investors.
Well, look, there's a number of events that have occurred over the last 2 years that I think will continue to shape the balance of the 2020s, and particularly from a property point of view. One of the key issues, of course, is the whole concept of working from home. I have been tracking this through the censuses for 25 years. 5% of the Australian workforce worked from home in 1996, and that proportion did not change for 25 years. Along comes the pandemic and it shoots up to 45 or 50%. I don't think in the post-COVID world it'll go back to 5%. I think it'll settle to something like 15%. That is a 10 percentage point shift in the proportion of people who are prepared to or want to work from home. That's 1.3 million workers. And it raises a very interesting point. If you are now working from home, then you kind of can't manage a family in an inner city chic minimalist apartment. You kind of need 3 or 4 bedrooms. You need a Zoom room. You need 2 bathrooms. You need front yard, backyard, the whole shebang. So the demands for property shift. And also, if you are working from home and you only need to go into the office, maybe once a week or once a fortnight or once a month or something like that, well, then you can move beyond the edge of the metropolitan area to the lifestyle zones around all our capital cities, Sea Change and Tree Change. And we saw this with the exodus from Melbourne. Melbourne lost 60,000 residents in the year ending June 2021. It normally adds 110,000. It lost 60,000.
Wow.
And when you look at the maps, you can see there's this like Goldilocks zone up to about 150 kilometres from the CBD. Places like the Bellarine Peninsula, the Mornington Peninsula, of course, Mitchell Shire to the north, Baw Shire to the southeast, and parts of Geelong, as well as the goldfields like Daylesford and Creswick and Ballarat and so forth.
Absolutely.
The whole range of lifestyle zones. And it goes to my core observation about Australian motives and consumer behaviour. We are a lifestyle-driven people. It is evident in our relentless pursuit of suburbia initially. It was evident in our relentless pursuit of inner city apartment, that sort of Manhattan-esque lifestyle. We've now shifted our priorities, and we're now looking for outer suburbia and lifestyle zones beyond the edge of the metropolitan area. And I think that's where property demand will be greatest, say, over the next 3 to 5 years or more.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And when you sort of touched on that, and I haven't heard the expression, the Manhattan-esque appeal, that's an ambition thing. Because, even a few years ago, there was the ambition that you're moving to the new Docklands apartment. And suddenly, I guess that ambition has shifted.
Well, yes, look, it shifted, I suppose, living in the inner city, and it still, offers a great lifestyle, and there's many people who will want that. It suits their needs and so forth. Yes. But if all of a sudden the nexus between where you live and where you work is altered because, half the office is working from home, and there's no point being in Collins Street or in George Street or wherever it is in Sydney and so forth, then another set of values drive Australian behaviour. You know what? I don't need to be here. I want a sea view. I want the green scene. I want a cute little village. I want to feel part of the community. I only want to come up to town once a month. And that opens up a whole range. Imagine what I can get for my money if I move to regional Victoria, regional New South Wales, or regional Queensland within striking distance of a capital city. Give an Australian half a chance and they'll take the lifestyle option every time. That is a recurring theme. Even the pursuit of suburbia in the post-war era by the returning diggers, that was driven by their concept of what comprised a wonderful lifestyle, 3-bedroom brick veneer on a quarter-acre block, driving to work or whatever. They thought that was wonderful. Well, we have gone through a number of iterations, and the latest iteration affected by the pandemic is actually to push it out to these lifestyle zones beyond the edge of the metropolitan area.
It's phenomenal, isn't it? And well, when you're talking about, you think when the dust has settled, and this is obviously in the future, which you're an expert at looking towards. So you're saying it's going from 5% working from home to around 15% when the dust has settled. We're still talking about 10%, of the workforce not reliant on trains, not reliant on that infrastructure, not reliant on cafes in the inner CBD or the restaurants. And, that's a dramatic change. 1 in 10 people that evaporates from that commuter, I guess, hub. How does that change then? Are they still going out, and is it changing the communities in these suburbs? Because at the moment, suburbs on the outer, parts of the city are, look, I'm just going to go home and shut the door and spend time with the family. But if people are living and working, I like to go and catch up with friends, and the friends might be on the other end of the city.
Well, yes. In fact, when you increase the dwell time in the suburban home, yes, it's almost like putting a defibrillator on the suburbs. They just jump into life. Yeah. And the great criticism of Australian suburbia was that it was comprised of dormitory suburbs. The people only were there at night. They're out throughout the day. Well, if you're spending 24/7 in the burbs because you're doing a Zoom call, as I am at the moment, then it activates suburbia. So local bike paths are used, local cafes, local office supply shops, local consultants around technology. Look at all the technology I've had to learn in order to conduct this Zoom call, including the camera and the microphone and the lights and so forth. So you need to get people there. So all of those consulting jobs and all those service jobs from the CBD need to be replicated out in the burbs. I don't also buy into the logic that, well, the CBD is going to die because you're taking 10% of the jobs out of the CBD and putting in the suburbs. Yes, that's true. However, if you look at the growth in office kind of work, lawyers, accountants, consultants, all that sort of thing, the ABS is very good at tracking that. And over 32 years of that data series, the annual growth in work jobs that are typically done in an office has increased by 6% per year. So give that 2 years and the office workforce is growing 10% anyway. So if you take 10% out of the CBD, put it in the burbs, that's fine. 2 years later, that market has actually regrown by the structural shift of the economy away from, say, labouring towards knowledge work, in fact. So I think, it's certainly going to have a sort of a depressing impact or deleterious impact over 2020, 21, maybe into 22. But then the growth in the workforce, the office workforce, counterbalances that. In fact, over the course of the pandemic, February 2020 to February 2022, the office workforce componentry of the workforce increased not by 6% a year, but in fact by 9% a year. We're actually adding more office kind of workers, but they've just been at home. A lot of them will in fact go back to the office in due course.
So the CBD impact, you feel will be a short-term blimp, but the changes to the hubs, the society and how people live in the burbs will potentially shift. And we've long seen a very positive correlation or strong correlation between property values and the accessibility to transport. It's around that 1 kilometre from a train station or the access point into the highway is a sweet spot for property prices. That may shift. It might be the local restaurant strip or the parks or walkways that may be now the stronger drivers of amenity.
Well, I actually feel that we'll see more, stronger suburban hubs. Now, whether it's, like a Dandenong or Box Hill or a Parramatta or Penrith, I'm going to have to go through all the cities now, Mount Gravatt or Chermside or whatever, Glenorchy in Tasmania, wherever. So you've actually got more people orientating towards their local centre rather than into the city. Now, of course, you need public transport. Access to do all that. But I think that you're actually creating kind of like mini-me CBDs scattered throughout the metropolitan area. And so that would also apply to the inner suburbs, those hipster suburbs that you see around the CBD would kind of start to emerge around like the Parramattas of the world or around the Box Hills of the world, over a 10 or 15 year period, I would suggest. The old model of living on the edge of a city and commuting to the city centre and then back out gain just does not stack up in a post-COVID world. Imagine saying to a millennial, great news, millennial, after 2 years of working from home, you can now go back to commuting from Cranbourne or Penrith into the city centre and back out again 5 days a week for the next 30 years of your career. They will say, I ain't doing that. There is a better model. And that model means I can get more bang for my buck by going to a regional town and commuting to the city, or in fact going just beyond the edge of the metropolitan area. There is another argument here, and that is that the millennials, people born 1982 through to 2000, actually start to push into their late 30s, early 40s over the next 5 years. And in that stage of the life cycle, you don't need to be in an inner city apartment. You need to have the whole family thing, because you've got kids, you've got a partner, you want to work from home. So again, I think there's a demographic driver for that traditional family kind of home that Australians have developed so well in suburbia and outer suburbia.
It's really interesting, isn't it? And you're sort of you touched on it a little while earlier, where potentially the types of properties may shift in terms of larger, Zoom rooms or layouts of these floor plans. Would that, that's a dedicated area. It can't be the kid's bedroom. We've seen those videos on YouTube of people walking in with the door opening. It does need to be a contained area. Does that mean that houses potentially need to be larger or more compound-like?
Well, and very much so. In fact, Daryl Kerrigan had the pool room. We have evolved the pool room, the Zoom room. See that plant over there?
Yes.
That is precisely positioned there. for
Is it real? Or?
No, it's a real plant. I kill them at the rate of one every 3 months, apparently. But you're quite right. I mean, our kids have left home, so there's plenty of rooms to choose from. But if you've got 2-3 kids or so, and both partners are working from home, then it's very much you do need the Zoom room. And it used to be that you used to be able to just jump on your laptop and send a few emails, after the evening meal or something like that. But if you're doing real proper business and doing Zoom calls and meetings and interviewing people and so forth, then you need a dedicated space. And so it kind of makes sense also that if you increase the dwell time in the family home, so you're spending more hours in the home per week, then in the consumer's mind, they think, I can actually invest more, or the house can take a greater share of wallet, either in the mortgage or in the home improvement and beautification, in the technology, or, if I'm here having lunch every day, you think, maybe I need a new Miele oven or something like that. Yeah. And so you get this sort of adornment and embellishment and improvement of the family home. People say, well, we can't go to Bali, or you can go to Bali or wherever it is. So I'm going to use that travel money and redirect it into improving my living environment with better quality lifestyle home.
It's interesting, isn't it? So probably just to summarise, we've got hubs, we've got focus or renewed focus on the periphery around the major capitals, and you're sort of saying out to a Goldilocks zone of around 150 kilometres. Well, that encapsulates it, and COVID's now almost, it's into its second year, or it's been a while, since we were exposed to COVID-19, but we've already seen a lot of pressure and price pressure in the Noosas of the world, the Gold Coast, even out to Toowoomba, inland of Sydney, Newcastle. Wollongong has been, growing very strongly in the last couple of years. Melbourne, Bendigos and Ballarats were in a growth cycle anyway. They've really continued to push through and potentially prolong that growth cycle. And Geelong and the Mornington Peninsula, we've started to see that. We have seen very strong price growth in those areas. But then when you dig into the micro and potentially the properties, you're talking about larger floor plans. And then that, probably another really important point that you just touched on for property investors is, as long as you don't want to overcapitalise potentially as an investor, you want to maximise your return. But if there is that general willingness for higher spec properties, for renovated properties, when you do renovate a property as an investor, then it's going to be more appealing to owner occupiers, and they're potentially increasing the value of your property. So I think that's a really important point, Bernard, in terms of yeah, maybe the tolerance, it's always a very key concern, not over-capitalising on a property, but maybe that buffer, that top end of that property there could be more emphasis up there. There could be more profit. So,
yeah, look, I do feel that this demographic argument of the millennials moving late 30s, early 40s is important. We're going to see a wave, around about 5.5 million millennials pass through the 42, the age of 42. It's a bit like an eclipse of a lunar eclipse, the 42-year-olds passing across the face of the moon. It's really important because I say at 42, round about that stage, you've got one or two kids, you're partnered up, your partner's probably gone back to the workplace. And at 42, you have another 23 years or thereabouts in the workplace to repay a mortgage. If there is anyone in the life cycle who needs more space because their kids are growing, it's kind of pre-teenage, it's 42-year-olds. So if you're renovating a property and gearing a property and you want to attract the people who are prepared to pay the most, then you would gear that property around a 42-year-old couple with kids who can offer, multiple bedrooms and front yard, backyard, 2 bathrooms and so forth. That's the kind of market, I think, that is going to flourish over the next 5 to 7 years. You can actually see the demography shifting. Wow. And so yes, all of the locations that you've identified previously, I think would fit the bill, and especially where you can get good value for money, because then coming out of an inner city apartment, the needs have dramatically shifted, I think. There's still going to be people who will want to live that lifestyle, but people who are moving to the late 30s, early 40s will want something else, and they're the ascendant demographic for the next 5 years or so.
It's really interesting because, the periphery of Australian capitals has traditionally been, where the lower price properties or the more affordable properties have been, and a renovation from investors' perspective in those properties has been, it needs to be functional, it needs to be good value. It's a value-driven renovation, in terms of we're not putting a marble bench top in, we're putting a flat pack kitchen in potentially. So there is an argument there for increasing that scope for the right type of property in the periphery, maybe not the 2 bedrooms or maybe not the small 3-bedroom floor plans, but good owner-occupier appealed property in those periphery hubs. There could be arguments made for a higher scoped renovation targeting that 42, work from home demographic. It's interesting.
Well, that's true. It's not just the work from home. The whole employment argument has shifted during the pandemic. If you look at some of the fastest growing jobs in Australia during the last 2 years, literally over the last 2 years, one of the fastest growing is the job of storeman or store person. It's about something like 40,000 net extra over 24 months. And that is because everyone's buying stuff online. The whole retail narrative has shifted. And so logistics, warehousing, distribution centres, or fulfillment centres. Amazon don't call their warehouse, they call it a fulfillment centre. So
fulfilling their life.
Fulfilling wishes, of course. Whoever came up with that term is absolutely marketing brilliance. Transportation, distribution, warehousing, logistics centres, taking spending out of shopping centres, and those things don't pop up in the city centre. They pop up on the periphery of the metro system or the freeway system around the edges or middle towards the edges of the capital cities. And so people then can live on the edge and go to work in these sort of new warehouse fulfillment, distribution, logistics centres. Good paying jobs and so forth. A lot of it is highly mechanised, of course. I certainly acknowledge that, but you only have to look at the ABS figures to say, well, 40,000 jobs being created in 24 months. Every one of those can take out a mortgage, is the way I'm looking at it. And those mortgages will not be in the inner city. They'll be on the city fringe and middle areas, and also perhaps in stronger regional centres as well. So when you look at that narrative, you think, I can build a very strong case to say it's time for outer metropolitan suburbia and the Goldilocks zone. It's your time in the sun.
Well, I think it's now also the Australian investors' time to capitalise on that information, because I think it's very insightful, and it shows how society can shift and where that opportunity can potentially emerge. But while we're having this discussion, Bernard, I'm really interested. Obviously, we have a very changing global fabric. Or a very strongly changing global fabric in 2022 with Russia and Ukraine, and obviously it's probably outside the scope of this conversation to discuss the specifics of that. But it is creating a refocus on defence. And spending around defence. And there's a lot of talk in the property investment community at the moment about Darwin, which might be re-emerging out of a slump. It's looking like the stars are starting to align once again, and it's looking relatively bullish. And then also Townsville. A lot of investors at the moment are talking about Townsville, two areas where defence plays a key part. How do you feel the focus on defence may change in the next few years? And I feel... is defence spending a positive or a negative? Defence spending, it means that there is a risk factor attached to it. There is the need to have a base there. Ongoing employment, obviously, and attracting the military spend there is a positive thing. But does that mean that it is also at risk?
Well, I certainly do think that concerns at a geopolitical level do create the rationale for a percentage point to be added to defence spending as a proportion of our budget. I think defence is around about 2%. If it was at about 3%, the full percentage point is another $20 billion that then gets scattered across a number of locations across Australia. Laverick Barracks, of course, in Townsville, Robertson Barracks in Darwin. But there's a whole range of other locations as well, certainly on the West Coast, with Perth, various locations there, and the northern suburbs of Adelaide with defence manufacturing and defence spending, particularly submarines and so forth. That would have an impact. Kind of related to that is the idea that we need to be far more self-sufficient in manufacturing, particularly smart and advanced manufacturing, and that we should be bringing home those manufacturing jobs or growing further jobs locally rather than offshoring them, as we have done previously. And you think, well, what cities on the Australian continent have strong manufacturing heritage and skill bases? Well, that'd be Melbourne, that'd be Geelong, that'd be Ballarat, Bendigo, Adelaide, probably Bathurst. There's a number of them around the country where there is defence manufacturing and manufacturing more generally skills, even in parts of Sydney, parts of Brisbane and so forth. You think over the longer term, I think Australians are going to demand more secure supply chains. That means more manufacturing locally. And that goes to the argument of warehouses, logistics, advanced manufacturing facilities. These are middle and outer suburbs. Again, this goes to my argument that edge of the capital cities and the lifestyle zones just beyond can actually be the targets of new spending and new skills and workers who will want to live in lifestyle areas within an easy commute of those workplaces.
So is what you're saying, just to clarify, maybe not the emphasis on the bases, the Darwin and the Toowoomba bases, but maybe the actual manufacturing associated with defence may cause the property-related impact?
Very much so. In fact, there's a whole industry, of course. The whole northern part of Adelaide is driven by defence, by space, and there's a whole range of industries that hang off a decision to increase our exposure to these sectors going forward. And they're very localised and can be quite transformative, and especially if you look at property prices on, say, the northern edge of Adelaide, or on the western side of Melbourne, or wherever, let alone in regional cities. Now, I think Laverick Barracks in Townsville had a boosting impact. Certainly, 20 years ago, where there was concerns about terrorism and so forth. So there was a bump, if you like, in defence spending, and then that sort of finds its way into the entire community. There's a logic to it that I think most certainly hangs together. Now, on a big picture level, I do think that you should be looking at investors, and anyone in Australia should be looking at the big picture drivers of the 2020s, and there'll be a shift in geopolitical alignment that will impact defence manufacture and so forth. The demographic shift of the millennials to their late 30s, early 40s, I think that, and then work from home. Now, these are very powerful mega trends that I think are going to reshape Australia away from the traditional model of, like the fried egg, where you have the rich creamy yolk in the inner city with all the, the best properties and so forth, and then sort of flattening out to the edge. I think it's going to be a bit more scrambled up in the 2020. I'm continuing my food themes, aren't I?
I think it's good.
Avocado.
It's making me hungry, and I did have a nice mixed up omelette for breakfast. We'll have to. What about a Burnism? We'll have to come up with a Burnism.
a Bernardism, right? Well, there's plenty of those out there.
I love your turn of expression. It really does. It does put some colour behind things. And it's look. I think the insights from today and the particular application for investors has been excellent. And the takeaway: Australia is always changing, and from my perspective, it's always changing. And where that change does occur, there is opportunity, and it's up to us to listen to folks like yourself to understand where that opportunity might exist. And I think that's invaluable. And we need to be aware of it. It's an absolute pleasure to have you joining us today, Bernard. It really has been phenomenal. And do you mind if I mention to the audience how they might be able to reach out to you further?
Absolutely. No, go ahead.
Yes. Well, Bernard is the Managing Director of the Demographics Group, who offer bespoke demographic data visualizations on global markets. And as you've seen today, they are delivered in a very engaging narrative by experienced speakers. Bernard, what would probably be your primary social media channel if people were to reach out and say hello?
My primary media channel is LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn, and I post several times a week all my columns, all of my insights, any new acronyms that I develop, I put there. So probably LinkedIn or Instagram are my preferred social media channels.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jacob.
Bye-bye.